My name is David Musa Pitcock. I was born in Sheffield in England in 1942 during the war, and my father was in the RAF at the time. He was an engineer in the RAF as well, but so we grew up. My mother was born in India. My father had gone to India to install rolling mills for Geskin and Williams, and had been injured in a car crash. My mother was a nurse in the hospital, and that's how they met. So just prior to the war, maybe 1938, they came back to England, and I was the third of 6 children. This is my mother and father, and this is in the 1941 or 42. He was on leave from Iceland, which is where he'd come back to Sheffield. Arthur Pitcock and Felicia Adelaide Campbell Thomas was her maiden name. My father's in his RAF uniform. This is during the war. This would be in the early 1940s. So he was stationed in Iceland. This is Henry Thomas, and he, as the book says here, James Henry Thomas, Political Department, Government of India, Secretary to the Nawab Ahsanullah of Bengal, 1877 to 1887. Going back to 1840, my great-great-great-grandfather, Henry Thomas, was the secretary to the Khan Ahsanullah Bahadur estates in what is now, of course, Bangladesh, but he died there and he's buried in Dhaka. But he ran as a political secretary for the East India Company. This is the Campbell side. So my mother's maiden name was Campbell Thomas, and she came from a large family of brothers and sisters, very staunch Roman Catholic. And he was Sergeant Major John Campbell, formerly of the 1st Bengal Native Infantry, circa 1857 to 1860. So the Campbell Regiment, of course, went in 1857 to put down what we called the Indian Mutiny, but which in actual fact was the first War of Independence in 1857. And he survived the Siege of Lucknow, and eventually he became, this is the Campbell, he became the superintendent of the opium factory in Gulzarbagh in Patna. So, but the British Empire was built on lies and deception, the whole system. They did a lot of good, but it was not for the indigenous population. It was just so we could actually steal the resources of those countries. So there was nothing altruistic about what we did. It was purely self-serving. I went to school, at a Roman Catholic school. My mother was very staunch Roman Catholic. And we went to St. Joseph's School in Handsworth in Sheffield, and where I stayed until I was 15. My father died when I was 11, so I had to leave and go to work, which started me off in the meat business. I joined a local firm and then discovered interesting things in the abattoirs about kosher slaughter, halal slaughter, and things like that, and had a very vivid education in the sense of that, which later became most valuable to me. I then did a second apprenticeship in engineering or machine tools, joined a local firm, and basically stayed until I was 19, early 20s, and joined another firm, and eventually became in business on my own. That's buying and selling machines, exporting them, and so that more or less. And also at the same time, I was singing semi-professionally. I was a singer and did the working men's clubs, nightclubs, and things like that. And basically had an education in the sort of lifestyle that would be pretty traditional for any South Yorkshire person or a northern town person. And eventually discovered certain things that I wasn't happy with in the business arena. And it came to the point where I started to question certain things that were done in the name of business, which I didn't like. The difficulties that I had in business were in Sheffield, my hometown, were primarily relating to my old boss, who was a Freemason. I found once that I had left the company, I resigned from the company, and they were not very pleased about that, but I was not happy with certain things that they were doing in terms of what I consider to be unethical practices. So, although my friend, it was his father's company, I still had no choice but to resign. Now, on resignation, I was visited by the father and also by the mother, and informed that I would never work again in Sheffield. And as I'd grown up, so I had to branch out and leave Sheffield area and move more towards the Manchester side, where I met and did business. So that was the first experience I'd had of people being able to influence your bank manager or influence people not to do business with you. And so that's how I discovered that the power of Freemasonry is linked directly to Zionism as well, and the power that they wield. In 1975, when I came to a realization that the problem was endemic, it was throughout the whole system. There was no where you could go. And I lived in Canada. We couldn't find anywhere where you could get honest opinions and honest money that came in to help a company, which, regardless of what it was, what kind of manufacturing it was, of any description, you couldn't get the money to run a company other than the money that coming in as a debt and penalising the company, which made it impossible for it to actually function. Come from a situation in Scotland. We bought a shipyard, and my partner defrauded me, and basically I came to the point where I was sick of having to deal with people who were not honest, they were bent, and had no sense of shame about doing anything, even though you'd made them lots of money, to embezzle money from you. And I just threw up my hands and I said, God, there's got to be a better way. I can't, emphasize it more than the fact that you reach a point where you've had enough. So in 1975, when I made that declaration, God, there's got to be a better way, the door was open for me and I was invited to go to Saudi Arabia, and that's where my journey to Islam begins. Within 24 hours, I was delivering a part for a machine in Sheffield, and the gentleman who was visiting a company in Sheffield, Mantegna Springs, he came into the works and said, do you want to go to Saudi Arabia? And in typical Yorkshire fashion, I said, well, can I go home and get changed first? And then within maybe, let's say, it was 5 weeks, because at the time we were trying to get visas, and in 1975 this is. It was very difficult to get visas for Saudi Arabia, particularly for 3 Khawajas, 3 Goras. But we ended up arriving in Jeddah on the first day of Ramadan in 1975. And we were taken from the plane directly to Petromin, the refinery just outside Jeddah. And it was a good introduction to Ramadan, because we didn't know we were 3 English men who'd gone there with no previous knowledge of Islam, apart from the fact you see from Lawrence of Arabia and the Crusades. We had this typical, a narrow vision of Islam and Muslims. So we were taken from the plane. It was very hot. We were in sort of autumn clothing, but it was very highly humid, maybe at 98% humidity. Anyway, we were taken to the refinery and met a very charming gentleman called Mansour Sehemi, who was laughing, not uncontrollably, but he was... Tears were almost running down his cheek. And what had happened, he'd sent a telex. Of course, this was 75, before we had faxes and texting, but he sent a telex to Houston, United Oil Products in Houston. And the telex he'd sent was, asphalt plant project held up due to Ramadan. So the American counterpart had sent the reply telex was, fire Ramadan, get somebody who can do the job. So this was our introduction. We finally knew Ramadan was somebody holding up the whole country. And that basically was the first encounter. I then met an American in the hotel where we were staying who was a convert. We were fasting during the day. In those days I used to smoke, so we couldn't smoke or drink and anything. We get to the hotel, the Red Sea Palace in Jeddah, and they wouldn't serve us because it was time for suhoor by the time we'd finished. And we were sitting in the restaurant wondering how we get served, and then a very loud, deep voice, you guys must be limeys, you know. So when I turned around, there was a very, very big gentleman, big beard. It looked like Charlton Heston in, the Red Sea crossing. And he was black, and he said, I'll order extra food, you come and join me. That's what happened. We got fed. And he then explained what the problem was. And so I sat and talked with him off and on, maybe for 3 days. And I observed fasting and praying, to the extent where, at the end of this period, a gentleman came to the hotel, and he was from the Taiwan embassy. He was called Dawood Yang, and he gave me a copy of the Gospel of Barnabas and a copy of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Now, having worked, my sister had converted to Judaism and my cousin, so I was very aware of Judaism and Christianity, but had no knowledge of this other side of Judaism, the dark side, let us say. So reading the Protocols, then everything fell into place, because I could see why we'd had problems with the courts and the judicial system, why, when you try to get banks to account, the whole system is basically the Pharisee system. And that is what is wrong with the country. As Jesus said, beware ye the leaven of the Pharisees. And that is what the rot within the country that we see comes from that particular school. So I read the Protocols. Subsequent, I've studied it in great detail. Of course, it is the Talmud in a much deeper form. But the Gospel of Barnabas, immediately the light went on. And it was obvious that this was the missing component, particularly as a Christian. So I was open, receptive. I'd been through so many battles with banks and everything, and I'd reached the point where I said, God, there's got to be a better way. And here I was, confronted with this information, which was powerful. When I realized that I was accepting Islam, was after I'd traveled with Sheikh Kamil Wadud in America. And certain things happened, coincidences happened, and I thought this is far too coincidental for him to have arranged all the things. Musa Pitcock, who was Jesse Owens' running partner before the 38 Olympics, people like that, Ernie Stevens, the American chief researcher or negotiator. And so by the time I got back to Newark, New Jersey on the round trip, it was the 11th of November 1975. So 1st of Ramadan, 6th of September 1975, 6th of October. By the 11th of November, I had no choice. It was just so obvious that it was the truth. That was instinctive, but it was confirmed by the evidence in Barnabas and the Protocols and my own experience of having worked in the Jewish community, garment business, music industry, machinery industry. So I knew that there was something different that we weren't being told, and now the Protocols confirmed that there was a definite agenda which was not very pleasant. Since I reverted in November 1975, obviously it was long faces. People were not at all happy, particularly in a family like mine with my mother. Although, ironically, when my sister converted to Judaism, it wasn't viewed as a step down. But of course it didn't please the family at all. It was, I didn't want to trade in interest. I didn't want money on deposit. I sold the house that I had a mortgage on to rent a property as I rent this place. So it meant that I wanted to try it, put it to the test, in the sense that if it works in America, it must work here. So I was always trying things to see, but it was clear, interest and debt and those things I knew were the killer, and the banking system was the real destroyer of the society. Imam Ali said we withstood the weight of the iron, the stone and the lash, but found the hardest thing to endure is the burden of debt. Thomas Jefferson, 1,000-odd years later, said the modern theory for the perpetuation of debt has drenched the earth with blood and crushed its inhabitants under burdens ever accumulating. 2400 BC, before the Torah, long before Musa, debt was cancelled automatically in the 7th year. If you lent somebody, like in the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, if I lend you £1,000 or £1 million in the 6th year of the cycle, I must be prepared to write that £1 million off as sadaqah. The bankers are the criminals. Common Sense is the monthly newsletter of the Islamic Party, which we formed in 1989, in the wake of the Rushdie affair. And the first edition, of course, is on economics of equity, which Islam offers. We formed the party, we stood in the Bradford election in 1991, and our campaign material was about satanic purses, not satanic purses. Pity poor Bradford. The second important book is Napoleon and Islam. We translated this from French. This proves that Napoleon genuinely converted to Islam. He took the name Ali Bonaparte. When he saw the debt of France, he said, "It is amazing that this monster interest has not devoured all humanity. It would have done so long ago had not bankruptcy and revolution acted as counter poisons." This little booklet I did for the Iranian Islamic Center in Kilburn, The Truth About Money. In China, it was translated, as were the other books I took, within 3 days. And this book I finished for a man called Arthur Swan, who was locked up under Regulation 18B in 1939 for pointing out that the Bank of England had rearmed Germany along with the Bush family. Of course, he was locked up and until 1945, along with 5 volumes of this Islamic Encyclopedia of Islamic Economy. There are 5 books, and I was asked to do the foreword by the same publishers that published The Other Road to Serfdom. And this is the evidence that Islam has the answers, but the Muslims need to apply it to solve the problems of the world, and also thereby giving Islam the credence and the credit it deserves. The truth will out, but we've got to apply it to ourselves to lead the world out of the mess it's in. The key is that the Quran is the manual. And when you find yourself in a hole of your own making, stop digging and read the instructions, because there's no other way. And everything you want to learn is in there, whether it's about Freemasonry, understanding, everything. It says we have omitted nothing from this book. That's the secret. It's the manual. Get on with it.